Right, okay, last time I ended by telling you about the Romanian orphanages. I'm going to start by just playing a 10-minute documentary that was made by one of those orphans who was adopted from Romania.
It's really hard to look back because no one ever asked me this. No one ever asked me these questions. No one knew what was wrong. They just knew that when you first get polio, your leg gets numb, you can't move anymore. So my parents took me to a hospital known as Cămin Spital pentru Deficient Copii, Home Hospital for Irrecoverable Children. They never came back and just left me there. So the hospital put me into an orphanage. I grew up in the orphanage for 11 years. One of the things we discovered was a TV show called Dallas, and I loved it. I thought, wow, that is so amazing, that is beautiful. America was heaven, really, is what it was. Next thing you knew, Americans were in Romania. They came to our orphanage and were interested in adopting. I was so excited, overwhelmed. I just said, yes, I'm finally going to America. This is happening for me, wow. The tall lady kept crying. I asked the translator, why is she crying? The translator said, because she's so happy she found you. She's been looking for you. And that's who I want my mom to be, is what I told her. I asked my adopted mom, are you guys coming back? Yes, we're coming back tomorrow for you. The next day, I waited at the window for hours, and I thought, they're not coming. They just stood me up. I felt like I was being played again. My hopes were up. I was never gonna get out. When I heard that they were back, I was so happy that we were forgotten and left.
From ABC News, around the world and into your home, the stories that touch your life.
Tonight, we'll follow the story of an 11-year-old boy who made it to America after he was written off as hopeless by the Romanian government. Perhaps you remember Isidore. His crime, contracting polio shortly after birth.
The way I walk, I'm embarrassed sometimes. I gotta admit that. So the brace that I wear today is 4 years old. Well, one of the lock joints actually broke. The guy at the Creative Technology in Colorado that fixed the lock for me, he was so nice. I carry a guilt for that because, you know, I get bills in the mail from him, and it's hard to make it financially.
I saw just a little quick report, and I kind of perked up of like, what children, what orphanages. I was on a plane, I was there within a week. And we went from orphanage to orphanage to orphanage. You know, and there were just kids and babies everywhere. Nicolae Ceausescu was a megalomaniac dictator who ruled Romania with an iron fist and basically destroyed the country. He outlawed abortion, he outlawed contraceptive. Every woman was required to have 5 children. And his feeling was, in order to have a strong country, he needed to populate the country. And so there were literally hundreds of thousands of children that were warehoused in state-run institutions and orphanages.
Tonight, 2020 begins with a dilemma. A story that's so shocking that we know those of you at home are going to be disturbed by what you see. But a story that's so important that we just couldn't look the other way.
And I think Tom Jarrell's report were the first photographs to show the cruelty, and people were outraged. I'm Dr. Jane Aronson, and I'm an adoption medicine specialist. When you hear me talk about Romania, as the expression goes, you cut your teeth, right? This was how I learned about, about adoption. Sorry. I haven't talked about this in a long time. It was the most unreal experience that I've ever had in my life. It's so heinous, it's so vile that you can't even take it in. I felt nauseous and faint, almost like guilty for even being there. They were skeletal and emaciated. And I've never seen that anywhere except Romania.
You know, that's Isidore's reality. And there's probably issues for any adoptive kid, you know, and for Isidore maybe more than the typical kid, because he wasn't abandoned to another family. He was abandoned in a hellhole. But he went into a really loving family in San Diego.
Remember the three musketeers we met at Sagatu-Martyr? Well, they now live in the same neighborhood in San Diego and are still the best of friends. 13-year-old Isidore has become the All-American baseball player.
At a certain point as a teenager, he lashed out at that, and he'll say, you know, I guess I was subconsciously trying to get them to reject me. I didn't feel like I deserved this.
Oh, I was so worried about him because he wouldn't talk at that point anymore. And he would just be in there in the dark listening to his music. He wouldn't talk to us about it. At that time, we were the first people to get children out of Romania. I mean, babies had come out, but they weren't experiencing all of these difficulties yet. And we just didn't know what to do. He had a unique problem that we didn't know how to help him with.
So that's the problem with families, where they were not prepared for what their kids' development would be like. There's some people who think that because kids can't remember what happened to them the first 2 or 3 years of life, therefore it won't have an impact on them. And that's not true. What is it about being raised in an institution that leads to such bad outcomes for many kids? So that's why we landed in Romania and why we settled on looking at kids in institutions, because it represented a profound form of early neglect. So in our project, we have found consistently and long-lasting experiences are important for facilitating brain development. Around between 22 and 24 months, there's a cut point. Unless those experiences occur in that window of time, then development can go off track.
What happens in situations of neglect is that the experiences are lacking. So the brain is sort of in a holding pattern saying, okay, so where's the experience, where's the experience, where's the experience?
So if there are no experiences, then the brain is going to be miswired.
We see evidence in our children who are raised in institutions.
They tend to have much lower IQs, a lot of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, a lot of anxiety, attachment problems, difficulties in interpersonal relationships.
They actually show smaller brains. And finally, when we record the brain's electrical activity, they show much less electrical activity.
And so what parents should be expecting is that the longer they've spent in that institution, the more effort they may have to put into treatment or interventions for their kids, with the expectation they may never get that kid back to even keel. So there are big lessons for this project for not just kids coming out of institutions, but kids who experience severe maltreatment early in life.
The big question is what happens 10 or 20 or 30 years down the line. And I think no one really knows the answer to that question, but the speculation would be, as you go through life, you have more and richer experiences. And if you don't have the hardware to take advantage of those experiences, you'll find yourself increasingly disadvantaged.
I moved out of my parents' house when I was about 17. So for a while I just moved from place to place, all in the same city. August 2011. I took a plane and flew out to Denver, Colorado, and tried to begin a new life. Here in Colorado, I don't have a family close by. Ultimately, I think I like being on my own. You know, it's a wishful thinking. If it were possible, I would live in Romania, back where I grew up in Sighetu-Marmației. It's always going to be my hometown.
I think his life dream is to work with and in Romania. I think he will be coming back and forth. He's told me that he feels to make a change in Romania, he's going to have to spend time in Romania.
Watching him kind of grow up and then now seeing him as a full-grown adult who wants to go back and now make a film, you know, about the kids who didn't get out. So, I mean, it's a full, you know, I don't feel like the circle has ended yet. I sort of feel like I will always be doing the Romania story as long as I'm breathing. I think it was trip 3 or 4 where I ended up finding a baby and went back a month later and did adopt her. And then several years later, went back with the plan to adopt a second child.
One of the reasons I'm doing this documentary is due to the fact that I don't want this to be repeated, to have more Romanian orphans or orphans around the world.
Together, we hope to give a voice to all the children who had not been given the chance.
My life is speaking awareness.
People Somebody said they talked to someone who says they
What they can do to help. And I guess trying to find solution to people that are struggling. People that have the ability to achieve, to advance, to do something valuable with their life. That's what I would like to accomplish as part of my life. I have been known more for being an orphan for almost 22 years now. That is my identity, and sometime I would like to close that chapter and not be known as an orphan.
So hopefully that gives you a bit more context to what we were talking about last time, and also, makes it a bit more real as we're actually, putting a face to what we're talking about. And what we're talking about is a pretty extreme example of early neglect. But as we talk about some particular individuals and so on in this course, what you'll see is that their backgrounds really were quite extreme in terms of the neglect and so on that they may have experienced. So to continue on the discussion on attachment, I told you last time about John Bowlby, but attachment theory really has 2 founders, okay? And the other is Mary Ainsworth. So, John Bowlby was a theorist, he was a therapist, but he wasn't a researcher. He didn't really have a way of empirically studying or testing his ideas. And this is really where Mary Ainsworth comes in, who was an American researcher, and she did come up with a way of empirically testing the attachment styles. So this method is the strange situation. You've probably heard of it before, okay? But what happens is a young child is brought into a strange room with their caregiver. There's a stranger in the room, okay? And then the caregiver leaves, and then they return. So what we're looking at here is a number of behaviors. How do they respond to the new environment? How do they respond to the stranger in the room? How do they respond to being left by the caregiver? How do they respond to the caregiver returning? Okay, so a secure child, someone who has a secure attachment, who has associated the caregiver as a safe base, okay, they explore the room with confidence, okay? They don't have to look back to make sure the caregiver's still there. They're not, paranoid or insecure over being abandoned. They explore with confidence. They're okay with the stranger, so long as the caregiver is there and they're okay with the stranger. And then they get upset when the caregiver leaves. It's unexpected. But once the caregiver returns, they're very quickly soothed. They're very easily made happy again, okay, and made to believe that everything is okay. The second child, the anxious, resistant child, is anxious to begin with, okay? It's a new environment. They don't like that. There's a stranger in the room. They don't like that. They're very clingy with the caregiver, okay? Worried about being left alone in the room. When the caregiver leaves, they're very, very intense in terms of their emotionality, okay? They're crying with a lot of intensity. The stranger in the room has no chance of soothing this or comforting this child, okay? They can maybe comfort the secure child, but not the anxious child. And then once the caregiver returns, okay, the anxious, resistant child remains upset for quite a long period of time. It takes a long time for them to feel okay again. But also they have quite an underlying anger towards the caregiver over having been abandoned, okay? They will resent and resist contact from the caregiver once the caregiver initially returns. And then the third child is the avoidant child, okay? So this child doesn't really seem to be impacted by the presence or the absence of the caregiver, okay? They're fine in the room, exploring just fine when the caregiver's there. They don't react when the caregiver leaves. They don't react when the caregiver returns, okay? So you might think, this is independence, but it would be atypical to be this independent at this early an age, right? We're talking about usually around 18 months when the strange situation is measured. There's just an illustration here, okay? It's on the slides for you to look at. There's also a YouTube link if you want to actually see it in practice. But it's basically what I've talked about. And these are the observers, the behaviors we're observing. So how willing the child is to explore. One way of coding this would be how many of the floor tiles they explore when looking around the room. Separation anxiety, reaction when the caregiver leaves. Response to the stranger anxiety, and then reunion behavior, how they respond when the caregiver returns. So I'm not going to go through all of this because it's what I've said, and the table is on the slides for you. But, secure child explores using the parent as a safe base, comforted when the mother returns, avoidant, uninterested, unconcerned with the absence or return, anxious, intense distress when the mother leaves, when the mother returns, approaching but resisting contact. So the first question might be, well, why are there different attachment styles in these children? Why are some secure, some anxious, some avoidant? So there's some differences in biological temperament from an early age, okay? Some infants respond differently to the same situation. Some are more easily soothed by nature. Some are a bit more intense. Some are a bit more moody, okay? But actually, when it comes to explaining differences in attachment styles in children, the vast majority of the variance is explained by environmental factors. So I told you before about identical twins being separated at birth, raised in different environments. We look for a correlation between them in terms of personality or antisociality or criminality. And overall, the correlation is about 0.5, meaning that about 50% of the variance is explained by genetics. When it comes to these types of studies, identical twins, separated, raised in different environments, and we look for a correlation in attachment, we find a correlation of about 0.14, okay? So it's much, much smaller. There's only about 14% of the variance being explained by genetics in terms of why people have different attachment styles at this early an age, okay? So the vast majority of the variance has been explained by environmental factors. So this is where Mary Ainsworth's caregiver sensitivity hypothesis comes in. That basically sensitive caregivers give rise to secure children, okay? If the caregiver is sensitive, dependable, okay, they can be relied upon, then a secure attachment is developed. If the caregiver is inconsistent, okay, so they're not so dependable, the child can't really predict how they're going to react. Sometimes they can be quite volatile, okay, or pretty impatient, okay. This is what gives rise to anxious, resistant attachment. And if the parent is unresponsive, leave the child to it, okay, then that's when an avoidant attachment develops, okay, in which, the child learns, well, I can't rely upon the caregiver for this. I have to be independent from an early age. I have to, cheer myself up and look after myself. So that was the three original attachment styles, and it's still the three main ones. But one of Mary Ainsworth's PhD students, Mary Main, observed a fourth attachment style called disorganized. So this is a child who has a combination of anxious behaviors and avoidant behaviors, but also some pretty unusual behaviors, like maybe cradling back and forward or hiding in the corner of the room, or kind of self-soothing practices. Now, disorganized attachment on the whole is pretty rare, okay? About 4% of people have a disorganized attachment, okay? About 60 to 65 have secure attachment. about 20% have avoidant attachment, and about 12% have anxious resistant attachment. So disorganized attachment is by far the rarest, okay? But when we look at particular forensic populations, especially those who were abused early in life, okay, disorganized attachment becomes much more common. Actually, when we look at populations of those who were abused across their childhood, disorganized is more frequently found than anxious or avoidant, okay? So disorganized attachment really seems to be a product of maltreatment early in life, okay? It's when one identifies the caregiver as a source of threat, okay? So this might give rise to self-soothing practices like repetitive self-injury or disassociation, which is when one escapes from reality, they escape into their own fantasies, okay? Now, what we find is disorganized attachment early in childhood has a number of outcomes that it predicts, okay? It predicts later on having difficulty controlling behaviors, regulating emotions, impulse control. It predicts low levels of self-esteem that are chronic. Predicts being more likely to develop dissociative disorders, not being able to tell reality from fantasy, and also being more abusive as an adult, okay, with one's own children or in a romantic relationship, so domestic violence. Okay, just to make sure you're kind of keeping up, okay, I'll just read these out and just tell me which attachment style is it describing. So I missed you, but now you're back, so I'm okay. Secure, right? You left again, I'll take care of myself. Avoidant, right? Why did you leave? I get so mad when this happens. Anxious, right? I wanted you to be here, but you left. Now you're back. I don't know if I should be happy or sad. Disorganized, right? Is there any questions so far on these 4 different attachment styles in childhood? Okay, another question might be, how do these relate to attachment styles in adulthood? Okay, so it does certainly seem to be the case that there's a correlation. Okay, according to a meta-analysis, it's about 0.39. Okay, so it's a moderate, almost strong correlation. So what this means is, yes, your attachment style in childhood somewhat predicts your attachment style in adulthood, but it doesn't determine it, okay? Because your attachment style in adulthood and relationships will also be impacted by a number of other factors, okay? It could be previous relationship experiences as well, right? Or the death of a loved one, or, being cheated on in a relationship, any factors such as this might have you be more likely to develop an insecure attachment style later in life, okay? But certainly, for the most part, those who have a secure attachment style in adulthood are more likely to have come from supporting families. Those with an avoidant attachment style, more likely to have come from distant, aloof families. One question you might have is, once you're an adult and you're having romantic relationships and you have your relationship style, is it possible to change it? The literature on this suggests not really, okay, that through psychotherapy, it can possibly change, but it's very difficult to do so. But I would argue, even in spite of that literature, there's still a lot of benefits that can come from understanding your attachment style, and just understanding it can help you avoid a lot of the issues that might arise from a particular attachment style. As we'll see, if you have an anxious attachment style, you're more prone to jealousy and paranoia when it comes to abandonment, and more likely to take on the blame for every issue that happens in a relationship. But if you're aware of that, okay, and you're aware of the fact that this, paranoia you're feeling isn't rational, it's not rooted in something rational, it's rooted in a early trauma or something else, okay, then, you can reflect on your emotions and stop it from impacting your behavior, right? You can stop yourself from acting obsessively or jealously with jealousness. Okay, so we might not necessarily be able to change our emotional reactions to things that, are maybe caused by our attachment styles, but we can certainly take control of the behaviors, okay, that we have, okay? So in terms of what this looks like in adulthood, okay, in adult relationships, those with a secure attachment style find it pretty easy to get close to others, okay? They're comfortable depending upon others and opening up and trusting others. They don't worry so much about abandonment. Unsurprisingly, they're more likely to be in a relationship, and they're more likely to be happy when they're in a relationship. Those with an avoidant attachment style, for them, it's unnatural to get too close to someone. It feels unnatural to trust someone. They're so used to doing everything themselves and relying upon themselves that it will be difficult to open up, to depend upon others, to trust others. They're also, unsurprisingly, the type least likely to be in relationships because they will put their energy maybe into something else, like a career or something else in their life, and less likely to pursue a relationship in the first place. And then those with an anxious attachment style, they will worry that the partner doesn't actually love them. They're always worrying about what the partner actually thinks, what they actually feel. They're more prone to jealousy, paranoia. On the extreme end, possessiveness and obsession, okay? So what we find is on the extreme end, anxious attachment predicts stalking behavior. When we talk about stalkers later in the course, we'll find that pretty much all stalkers have an anxious attachment style, but it's on the extreme end, okay? But they often feel as though people don't get as close to them as they would like, okay? Yeah. Okay. So those who have a secure attachment style early in life are the ones least likely to have their attachment style change. Okay, but certainly it could happen. Some of the things you talked about, but it could also be impacted by, like I said, a death of a loved one, or having been, misused, or feeling as though you've been taken advantage of. Something like that might moderate your attachment style and have you develop an insecure attachment style. But for the most part, the secure attachment style is the one that's most consistent. Yeah. Any other questions? There's a questionnaire here on the slides, okay? Just if you want to see, what the questions are and so on, if you want to take the test for yourself. Let me say one other thing, actually, in relation to self-esteem, okay? Because I also said that part of John Bowlby's theory was that the early attachment styles kind of act as a working model for future relationships. If one has a secure attachment style, they typically have a positive self-esteem, okay? And they typically have a positive perception of others as well. If one has an avoidant attachment style, that usually corresponds to higher self-esteem, but poor expectations of others and poor perceptions of others. If you have an anxious attachment style, it's the opposite, okay? Low self-esteem, but sometimes a more inflated perception of others, okay? View of others. So that's why anxious attachment types in relationships more likely to assume that every issue is their fault rather than maybe, both people's faults or the partner's fault. And disorganized is the opposite of secure, okay? Both low self-esteem and low perceptions of others, low expectations of others. By the way, in adult relationship styles, the disorganized one is sometimes called fearful avoidance, in which one, wants to get close to people, but also then once they are getting close, runs away and doesn't actually want to be too close, even though they long for closeness, but once it's actually occurring, it's too frightening, so they then retreat from it. I also want to talk about parenting styles and how these might relate to attachment styles. So these are broad dimensions, okay? It's not the case that you're one of these parenting styles and none of the others, but for the most part, people can be described as being more like one of these than the other three in terms of how they act as parents, okay? Authoritarian is demanding, unquestioned obedience, okay? I am the authority figure, therefore you obey, okay? You don't need to know why, it's just because I'm the authority figure, therefore you do as I say, okay? That's the authoritarian approach. So the consequences of this is that communication isn't really valued, right? There's no point in the child saying what they think because it doesn't matter. They know the parent won't listen. It's the parent's way or the highway, okay? The child has no ability to negotiate on things, okay? Whereas when it comes to authoritative, the parent is still in control, okay? The parent is still enforcing rules and being firm, but there is some negotiation, okay? So in this case, the parent explains the reasons for the rules, okay? They make them privy to it. And the child might even be able to push the boundaries through discussion, okay? So the child says, I want to stay out until 9 o'clock. The parent says, well, that's too late. You can stay out until 8:30. And then if you're home on time and you behave, then maybe we'll talk about increasing, your bedtime until 9 o'clock. And then, maybe increasing it further if you continue to behave. So in this parenting style, the child begins to understand that there is value to communication, okay? Unlike in the authoritarian style. Permissive is basically spoiling the child, okay? Very few demands. The child does as they please. The parent bends to the will of the child and just wants to please them. So the main issues with this is that it is setting the child up to fail, okay? It's teaching the child that they can always get what they want. Things will always go their way. But of course, in real life, they won't always get what they want. Things won't always go their way. And so they're impacted much more severely when things don't go their way in adulthood than a typical child, okay? Because they haven't learned to cope with this. They haven't learned to experience it, okay? That things won't always be the way that they want them to be. And then uninvolved is being emotionally neglectful, okay? It's still fulfilling the basic needs of the child, still putting food on the table, but not really interested in developing a close emotional bond, not really interested in what the child actually likes and values, not really interested in getting to know the child on a deeper level. So some examples, okay. Matilda's parents, right, pretty uninvolved, okay, they don't really care what she's interested in or what's happening in her life. The mum for Malcolm in the middle, right, she kind of lays down the law, right, and the kids don't really have much chance to put forward their opinions. Brooke Assault's father in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, right, he devotes his entire factory to finding her a golden ticket, right, and does whatever she wants him to do. And then, Mufasa from The Lion King, probably a good example of authoritative, right? He's strict and firm with Simba, but he explains why the rules are in place, right? And facilitates good communication between them. So when working this out, you can do so by looking at it on two dimensions. So we have a dimension to do with how strict and demanding one is, and then a dimension to do with how warm and responsive one is. So if one is both demanding and responsive, they would be authoritative, okay? So that's responsive, high expectations, but also democratic, okay? Clear standards. If one is high in demand but low in warmth, that would be authoritarian, right? Very structured environment, but very high expectations, clear punishments in place. If one is both low in warmth and low in demand, that would be uninvolved, right? Pretty passive, absent parenting. And if one is low in demand but high in response, then that would be permissive parenting, which would be, overindulgent and spoiling. So the thing that's most clear is that authoritative parenting predicts the best outcomes in life, okay? The best outcomes for social development. Better cognitive development outcomes, social development outcomes, higher self-esteem, being happier, being more independent, less likely to have depression, anxiety, in comparison to the other three parenting styles, okay? Also predicts better academic success. Now, it's not the case that a parenting style determines any of this, okay? It's not the case that if you parent this way, this will be the outcome, okay? But it's just that these are maybe more predisposing factors, okay, that make these outcomes more or less likely, okay? So, authoritative, like I say, predicts good self-control, high self-esteem, high levels of maturity. Authoritarian predicts higher levels of anxiety, depression, low self-esteem. But also in some cases, there can be quite a lot of resentment towards authority and then a lot of rebellious acts, okay, later, especially in the teenage years. Permissive parenting, no respect for authority. Why would there be? The person's never been taught to respect authority. So as they grow up, it predicts disobedience, impulsivity, getting kicked out of school and getting into trouble at school and overall poor school achievement. And then uninvolved parenting predicts, again, higher levels of depression, anger, resentment, and again, poorer school performance. In terms of the association between parenting styles and attachment styles, the most clear association is that authoritative parenting predicts secure attachment, okay? That's the one that's most robust in the findings, okay? The one that's most consistently found. In some cases, uninvolved parenting predicts avoidant attachment. In some cases, the authoritarian parenting predicts anxious attachment, okay? But the one that's most clear, most robust is that secure attachment is predicted by authoritative parenting. Any questions on the parenting styles or their overlap with the attachment styles? A couple of other things to briefly mention in regard to parenting is, first of all, harsh physical punishments. Okay, important because pretty frequent in the US. 80% of American parents admit to physically punishing or smacking their child on self-report surveys. We do know from the literature that those who are physically punished are more likely to be physically aggressive, okay, in teenage years, but also more antisocial beyond that. It might be the case that, you're therefore taught that this is a suitable way to deal with conflict, to resolve disputes, okay, to resort to aggression. It also predicts a number of behavioral and conduct disorders. And then, of course, even more extreme than this is child abuse, okay? This could be verbal abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, or it could be severe neglect, okay? All of these are forms of maltreatment. Again, important because of the large number of cases reported in the US of child abuse. Abused children significantly at higher risk of an insecure attachment style, particularly a disorganized attachment style, and also a higher risk of a number of mental health issues, okay, higher rates of depression, obesity, substance abuse disorders, and mood disorders, and also involvement in violence. Okay. So, part of why I'm telling you this is because it's, laying the foundations for understanding the offenders we're going to study in the next module. Okay. We're looking at the risk factors, and what we'll find is that quite often there is a combination of risk factors in particular cases, but also some individual risk factors are more tied to some types of offenses than others. So I said insecure, anxious attachment predicts stalking behavior at the extreme. We'll also look at the fact that fire setters very often have disorganized attachment styles as well. Okay, I just have another very quick video to share with you, just kind of setting the theme for what I want to talk about next.
It looks like rain again today. Dark clouds gather and fill the sky. Don't know how to talk to you, just know how to say goodbye.
Have you actually got a driver's license? I don't think so. Go back where you came from. Learn to speak English. Go back where you came from. Is that what you think?
So unsurprisingly, children are also largely influenced by what they see during their upbringing and the environment in which they're born to, which is really what the next thing I want to talk about is all about, which is behaviorism and social learning. Now, I'm going to go through some of these main theories pretty quickly, but they should already be familiar to you from at least intro to psych, okay, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, social learning. Okay, if you still have questions about them, okay, please do ask, okay, either during class or come up and ask after, or arrange a time to talk about it. But you do have to be familiar with these, okay, for the exam and for going forward. So behaviorism, really the second force in psychology after Freud's theory, okay, believing really that people are a product of their environments, really that's at the core of behaviorism. John Watson was really at the forefront of behaviorism initially, and then B.F. Skinner took over. So for John Watson, it's very much about classical conditioning, right? Which was first studied by Pavlov in relation to dogs producing saliva. But it's basically when two stimuli are paired together, right? So in this case, Pavlov was doing experiments on producing saliva in dogs. And what he was finding was, yes, getting fed would produce saliva, but also they would begin to associate signs of the food approaching, okay? So the footsteps of the person who would feed them, and that too would have them produce saliva, okay? And when this is experimentally tested, it could be, for example, ringing a bell or blowing a whistle as the dog is getting fed. And then eventually, even if the dog isn't getting fed, just hearing the bell or hearing the whistle will be enough to produce saliva, okay? Even though there's no food, because of the strong association between this stimuli and the food, okay? So in this case, the whistle is the neutral stimulus that then becomes a conditioned stimulus, okay? Because it's paired with an unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus is the one that produces the response naturally, okay? The conditioned stimulus only produces the conditioned response because it's been paired, okay, with that which will produce it naturally. So for John Watson, this was really at the core of understanding why people think the way they do about various things, the anxieties, phobias that they have. And he studied this most well known in the case of baby Albert, right? Little baby Albert was shown a white rat, okay? He didn't cry, he wasn't upset. In fact, he would reach out and want to play with the white rat, okay? But then every time he did so, John Watson would strike a hammer against an iron bar, a horrible noise that would produce a horrible noise that would cause baby Albert to cry. And then eventually, because of the association between this horrible noise and the white rat, just the white rat was enough to have baby Albert cry, okay? It didn't even have to be paired with the banging. So the rat went from being an unconditioned neutral stimulus, rather, went from being a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus, right? Because it's then producing this conditioned response because it's been paired with the horrible noise, okay, which is producing this crying response naturally, okay? And this also generalized, right? So for baby Albert, he was also shown a white rabbit, and this also had him cry because, he generated a fear of white furry creatures in general, right? So it was a kind of generalized fear. So, in relation to people, maybe you want your child to value reading, okay? You could, tell them a story and hug them and keep them close as you do so. And then they would form a positive association, right, between reading and being comforted by their parents, okay? And that classical conditioning would have them form a likeness for reading, okay, because of the positive association with it and being comforted. And then, John Watson's career was cut short pretty early, and B.F. Skinner then really took over behaviorism. And for him, he looked at it slightly differently. Some behaviors are a product of classical conditioning, he said, but also some behaviors are a product of operant conditioning, okay, which is basically that some rewards encourage behaviors and make it more likely they'll be repeated, whereas some punishments discourage behaviors and make it less likely they'll be repeated. So there's two types of punishments and two types of reinforcements in operant conditioning. And Skinner mainly studied this in what he called the Skinner box on animals, pigeons and rats mainly. But positive reinforcement is when you're presented with a positive stimulus. So in the case of the animals, if the rats pressed the right lever, they were given a piece of food, okay? And that would encourage them to continue pressing that lever, okay? In relation to people, it could be giving a child a gold star or a salesperson a bonus or some other reward, okay, for behavior you want to encourage, right? And then there is positive punishment, which is the presentation of a negative stimulus. So in the Skinner box, if the rat pressed the wrong lever, he got electrocuted, okay, making it less likely it would press that lever again. In people, there could be any punishments, right? It could be, we talked about physical punishment, it could be smacking a child, or it could be some other discipline, okay, in the form of a punishment that's being presented. Negative punishment is the removal of a positive stimulus, okay? So, maybe you misbehaved when you were a teenager and as punishment, your parents took away something you valued, right? They took away your phone, for example, or maybe TV privileges when you were a kid, right? So it's removing something positive, okay? And then negative reinforcement is the removal of a negative stimulus, right? For the rats, it was a horrible noise that would only stop once they pressed the right lever, okay? And people, it could be, learning to put on sunscreen because you've learned that makes it less likely you'll get sunburnt, right? So you're avoiding that outcome that you don't want, getting sunburned. Okay, questions on classical or operant conditioning? You understand them? Okay. But the main issue with these types of learning theories and behaviorism in general is that it really views the person as completely passive, okay? They are passively learning just because of what's happening in their environments, okay? They're basically like, you know, automatic machines, okay? Just responding to the environment that they experience. So social learning theory really improved upon behavioral theories, okay, by addressing some of the limitations. First of all, it began studying people instead of animals, but also it gave acknowledgement to the fact that there are individual differences, okay, that people have differences in what they value, they have differences in cognitive abilities, and all of this will impact the rate of learning, how they learn, how they best learn, and so on, okay? So it's not just the case that you passively respond to what's happening in your environment. You're active, okay? So Albert Bandura is really the one given credit for the advancement of social learning theory. And his best known study is the Bobo doll study, right? Which you've probably heard of. Children observed adults acting aggressively with a Bobo doll. And if they did so, they were more likely themselves to act aggressively with the Bobo doll than children who hadn't seen the parents, adults act with the Bobo doll. This was true whether the children observed the adults and the Bobo dolls in person or whether they observed it on videotape. Okay, so whether it was in person or on TV. Now, again, people are different, okay? So there's various factors that can impact how likely you are to take on the behaviors you've observed, okay? So for example, if you're more similar to the model, it's more likely you'll reproduce the observed behavior, okay? So this could be similar in terms of age, sex, but you know, a whole range of factors. But also if the model is perceived as being in high status, so well-dressed, for example, it's more likely also that the individual will model their behavior. Also characteristics to do with the observer. If they're lower in self-esteem, lower in self-confidence, more likely they'll reproduce the behaviors that they're observing, okay, from the model. And unsurprisingly, rewards and punishments can also make it more or less likely one will model, take on the model's behavior, right? In the original study, the girls who watched the adults act aggressively were less likely than the boys to act aggressively with the Bobo dolls, okay? But once they were given a reward, once they were told, repeat what you witnessed and you'll get a cookie or some other reward, they were then just as aggressive with the Bobo doll as the boys, okay? So it wasn't the case that they were unable to act aggressively with the Bobo dolls, okay? It was maybe the case that because of socialization, they believed there would be punishments, okay, if they acted aggressively. And once there was the promise of a reward, it was more likely that they would do the behaviors that they had witnessed, okay? So this also gives acknowledgement to the fact that you can observe behaviors and learn them and not reproduce them, okay? Which isn't really in line with the original behavioral theory, right? That you basically have to always be producing what you witness. So social learning theory, you can also call observational learning, okay? So in relation to how this might explain criminal behavior, it could be learned, right? You could be reproducing behaviors you've witnessed in a model. It could be criminal family members, okay, that you're modeling after. It could be in your subculture, so your peers, for example, modeling their behavior. Or it could be maybe wider culture, TV, movies, and so on. Also, if we look at the reinforcement elements, okay, that makes it more likely these behaviors will continue. The reinforcement could come in various forms, right? It could come in the form of financial rewards or material goods. It could come in the form of social rewards, so high status amongst your peers, higher dominance, or some other personal reward, okay, that's more specifically tied to the crime, right? So helping you evade capture for a previous crime, for example, or achieve some particular goal that you're looking to achieve. Or you may just feel good from having committed that crime and get away with it, and that could also be a form of reinforcement. So the critique of this is that it's an oversimplification, right? Certainly not all of those who observe crime go on to commit crime, and it doesn't really take into full account biological predispositions, but also differences in cognitive processes and the other factors that we're looking at, okay? Any questions on social learning? Okay, another thing I want to talk about before we finish is cognitive thinking styles, okay? Because what we find is that offenders very much have very different views on things, different thinking patterns, different perceptions than the general public do, okay? Now, sometimes these are a product of their upbringing, okay? Their upbringing has had them value things differently than what the typical person values, okay? But also sometimes it's a product of cognitive dissonance, okay? Rewriting the narrative in a way that's self-serving, okay? Because again, people don't want to be the villains, they want to create a narrative in which they're the hero of the story. And so they try to excuse things and to rationalize things, right? Now, this might seem kind of like common sense that obviously offenders are going to have different ideas on crimes than the general public do. But they are important because, first of all, the way we think about something has a large impact on our behaviors. But also when it comes to treating offenders in a prison, okay, confronting these distortions, confronting these thinking styles are a big part of the rehabilitation process, okay? Cognitive behavioral therapy, right, is all about challenging how you think about something, challenging your possible distortions. And cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the psychotherapies found to be most successful in the prison environment. So there's a number of studies on this, but I'm just going to give a couple of examples. When interviewing offenders, they found faulty thinking styles that could be found or tied to 3 categories in this particular study. So those they've called corrosion, which is really about rationalizing and justifying the crime before it's committed, okay? So, yes, I'm going to rob this house, but, I'm going to give some of the money to my relatives, I'm going to do this good with it. Or, this person doesn't deserve to have what they have, or, it's a dog-eat-dog world, I've just got to do what I've got to do. Some way of rationalizing, justifying the crime before they actually do it is present in their thoughts. Cutoff then is right before they commit the crime, okay? Putting aside any qualms or anything that might hinder them from going ahead with the crime, okay? So telling themselves, oh, I'm too smart to get caught, or some other form of super optimism, or something else that encourages them to go through with it as they're at the scene, okay, ready to do so. And then power thrust is to do with increasing their self-image right after they've committed the crime, okay? Well, I've proven that I'm strong now, I've proven I'm the powerful one, that I'm the dominant one. No one's going to, question me again or, insult me again, okay? Telling themselves that there's been some boost to their self-image. A similar study finding somewhat similar findings, but a different way of looking at it. Those that are to do with control, okay, so thoughts to do with the fact that they want to be in high status, they want to be the dominant one. If not, they'll be taken advantage of. Okay, it's a dog-eat-dog world. If you don't take advantage of others, you're vulnerable to be being taken advantage of. Cognitive immaturity, so kind of self-pitying. Well, it's just the way it is. Okay, what other choices do I have? Okay, look at my environment. Okay, I'm just doing the same as those around me. Or very impulsive. Okay, not really thinking too deeply about what it is that they're planning to do. And then those to do with being egocentric, right? Self-centered. Okay, the world centered around them. Okay, so looking at things in a self-serving way, right? Not really having any empathy or taking on the perspectives of their victims. Okay, only really thinking about how the world can help them or what they can do to better themselves. Now, Julianne Rotter was one of the first psychologists to really bridge the gap between social learning and cognitive theories. His theory is quite a simple one, but it's important for what we're talking about because significant differences are found. So for Julianne Rotter, people have a locus of control, okay? Meaning, what do you put responsibility on when it comes to things that go well in your life and things that go badly in life? So for Rotter, if you have an external locus of control, you put the blame or the responsibility on some external force, okay? Well, it was fate, it was destiny, it was God, it was bad luck, it was because of this person, because of that, okay? Because of some external factor other than themselves. Or some people have an internal locus of control, meaning that if things go well, it's because they must have put a lot of effort into it, or if it goes badly, it must have been because they didn't do it as they should have done. They've made a mistake, so they take responsibility. Now, this is more like a continuum, okay, rather than you being all one, none of the other. But in terms of offenders, what we find is that they're significantly more likely to have external locuses of control at the higher end, the more extreme end, okay? So never really likely to take responsibility for outcomes in their life, always quite likely to put the blame on some external factor. Does that make sense? Is there any questions on that? Like I say, there's a large body of literature on the differences in thinking styles between offenders and non-offenders. Lawrence Miller is a police psychologist in Florida, and in his review of the literature, he finds some commonalities. I've just listed some of them. But the habitual criminal, extremely invested in status, dominance, power. Their way of thinking is rigid, black and white. It's a me versus them perspective. Very little responsibility, external locus of control, justifying, rationalizing everything in a self-serving way. And then the relationships that they have in life are really characterized by mistrust and hostility, paranoia, okay? Not too surprising because they're probably also surrounding themselves with other antisocial individuals. Okay, any questions at all on anything I've covered so far? Okay, I finished up a bit early, but I don't want to go overboard by giving you too much. Okay, so next time we meet, I'll talk about temperament and peer rejections, or the consequences of peer rejection. And that's really then the last part of this module. Keep in mind, there's a quiz now open, and it's due by the end of tomorrow. Okay.